In the middle of a gleaming museum gallery, where cold white lights shine down on the fragile relics of ages past, there is an object so small that many people have to lean in close to see it clearly. A pair of lotus shoes, just slightly longer than an adult's palm. When the guide gently opened the glass case and lifted the shoes with 2 fingers, the group of visitors let out a soft gasp. Under the light, the shoes shimmered with golden threads embroidered with peonies, the tips curling upward like tiny bird wings, graceful yet perplexing. Simply imagining a real foot forced to fit inside them was enough to send a cold shiver up one's spine. That astonishment was the natural starting point to step back and ask, what does this exquisitely crafted beauty bear witness to? Why would something so small carry a history spanning a whole millennium? From the shoes lying silently behind the glass, the story drifts back to the Song dynasty, where legend tells of a concubine who danced for the emperor upon a golden lotus platform. To make her steps appear ethereal, she wrapped her feet with a strip of white silk, binding them tightly so they looked as small as budding lotus petals. Those tiny feet not only made her dance softer and more graceful, but also created a new symbol of courtly beauty, delicate, discreet, and, most importantly, belonging to one man alone. From a performance so enchanting that it captivated the emperor, the notion that the smaller the foot, the more precious, was born, kept within the palace as a secret of the elite, where anything favored by the emperor could become a standard for all under heaven. What's interesting is that in its early stages, foot binding was not common. It was a privilege of luxury. Binding a daughter's feet meant the family had enough resources to ensure she did no heavy labor, enough time to care for her constantly swollen, aching feet, enough money for fabric bandages, medicines, and specially made shoes. In other words, beautifully bound feet were a sign of status, proof that a family was wealthy enough to sacrifice their daughter's labor in exchange for refinement. In a society steeped in ritual and hierarchy like China, this was enormously appealing. Not everyone had the right to touch the symbols of the imperial court, so when officials, families, and scholar-official households began imitating the concubine, it became a new rung on the ladder of elegance. Over time, the image of bound feet no longer remained behind the red silk curtains of the Forbidden Palace. It slipped out, passed through aristocratic gates, and entered every corner of society. But each social group adopted the practice and attached different meanings to it. For officials, it was an emblem of refined beauty, a marker separating them from commoners. For Confucian scholars, it was a way to preserve family virtue, a symbol of household morality. For wealthy merchants, foot binding became the quickest way to flaunt wealth, showing their daughters were well-bred and proving they had the means to support a woman who did not need to work. Then it reached rural villages, where unspoken competition among mothers and daughters-in-law turned foot binding from a symbol of merchant-class prestige into an obligatory fashion. If other families bound feet, how could one's daughter go unbound? Who would marry her later? And so, from an elite emblem, it gradually became a heavy burden on the lives of millions of ordinary families. Yet foot binding cannot be explained merely by imitation or vanity. For it to endure more than 1,000 years, there had to be a deep cultural foundation supporting it. And it was Confucianism, the ideology that permeated Chinese society, that provided that support. Confucianism valued family hierarchy and upheld the ideal of the 3 obediences and 4 virtues: obeying one's father at home, one's husband after marriage, and one's son after the husband's death. Gentleness, modesty, silence, and humility were praised as feminine virtues. Within this logic, small feet became a perfect symbol. They prevented women from running or moving freely, restricted their presence in public, and confined them to the domestic sphere, which Confucianism considered their natural duty. The beauty of bound feet did not lie in their shape, but in the obedience they signified. A girl walking slowly, bowing before elders, speaking softly, with a swaying gait as if cherishing each step, all these combined into the ideal image of female virtue. Thus, the physical pain caused by foot binding gradually came to be interpreted as noble endurance, even as sacrifice for the family. From this point of view, one can understand why the custom spread like an underground current. It became a kind of social language, a way for families to assert their status and moral integrity through their daughters' feet. Beautifully bound feet were like a calling card when a girl reached marriageable age. In such a society, not binding one's feet was not only unusual, but also equivalent to being improperly raised, greatly reducing marriage prospects. And in traditional thinking, a daughter who could not marry brought shame upon the entire family. That shame was strong enough to push not only mothers but the girls themselves to accept pain, because they believed their future depended on the size of their feet. From this perspective, the concubine's dance for the emperor was merely the romantic starting point of a long and complex chain. Once outside the imperial palace, the idea of small feet met a society that placed great importance on family order, strict rules, and the rigid division between men outside, women inside. There, everything about a woman's body, hairstyle, clothing, posture, even voice, was defined by the community. Bound feet became an effective tool for restraint, for control, for shaping a proper woman whom everyone was expected to emulate. And once such a standard gained societal consensus, it held greater power than any argument. Even though it caused bleeding, fractures, and lifelong lameness, girls still believed they were walking the path laid out by their ancestors, their families, and society, a path they had no right to refuse. Yet it was precisely this quiet expansion that astonishes later generations. From a performance in the song court, foot binding became a massive social structure, stretching from cities to villages, from wealth to poverty. It not only restricted women's mobility, but also shaped the destinies of millions. They grew up in pain, matured with imposed pride, and lived their entire lives with the swaying steps society considered beautiful. And from here arises the sharpest question: what within the social structure allowed such a cruel standard of beauty to endure for so long? From the museum glass back into the past, from the tiny, shimmering shoes to the staggering footsteps of countless generations of women, the storyteller must go one layer deeper. If the origins are clear, then what happened inside the sealed chamber where a little girl first had her feet bound? That door opens the next chapter of the tale. And when that door opened, one saw a quiet morning inside the small chamber of a traditional house. There were no drums, no elaborate rituals, only the faint sound of water being heated in a clay pot, and the subtle scent of herbs drifting through the air. On the bed, a 6-year-old girl sat with her legs drawn in, eyes darting toward her mother, who was carefully placing beside her a pair of new shoes, so tiny they looked like toys. The grandmother sat on a low stool, holding a long white cloth band, her eyes a mixture of sternness and affection. The small room suddenly became the stage for a ritual the whole family believed would determine the child's future, even though the child herself had no idea what awaited her. Everything began with the basin of warm water the grandmother set on the tiled floor. She signaled for the girl to put her feet in. The rising heat made the girl flinch and pull back, but her mother held her hand, soothing her in a gentle voice. "Just a moment, you'll get used to it." The water was not only to soften the skin and ligaments, but also a psychological preparation. The initial comfort would vanish quickly, but for now it kept the child from running away. While the girl soaked her feet, the grandmother inspected each toenail with her fingers, nodding slightly as though assessing the quality of raw materials before beginning a craft passed down through generations. Next came the nail cutting. A seemingly simple step, but one with decisive importance. The nails were trimmed so closely that only a sliver of nail remained, leaving the skin around the tips stinging. The girl winced, pulling her foot back, but her mother's firm hand on her shoulder made her understand she was not allowed to retreat. With the swift confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times, the grandmother began straightening each toe and bending them downward toward the sole. A sudden sob escaped, but she did not stop. To her generation, this step was obvious, something she herself had endured long ago. Pain, in their eyes, was not an obstacle, but an essential component of becoming a proper person. As the toes began to fold, the long strip of cloth in the grandmother's hand was brought in. Each wrap had to be tight enough to keep the toes from springing back, but not so tight as to break the bones immediately. It was a technique adults described as painful enough, beautiful enough. The white fabric layered over itself, from the tips of the toes back toward the heel, pressing the toes inward as if trapping them in an invisible clamp. The girl grew increasingly breathless from the pain, each turn of the grandmother's hand stretching the nerves in her body taut. Her mother sat close, wiping the sweat from her daughter's forehead while whispering, "Just a bit more. Later, when you're grown, you'll be beautiful and marry into a good family." The child didn't understand what a good family meant. She only felt her head buzzing and tears spilling as the pain radiated through her feet. When the first layer of binding was done, the grandmother told the girl to stand. It was the moment no one wanted but had to come, the first step. The moment her foot touched the floor, she collapsed, her feet no longer holding their natural shape. Her toes, forced into the sole, made even the smallest movement feel like being stabbed with needles. Many girls said it felt like fire spreading from their toes upward. But she still had to be trained to stand upright, because from this moment on, she had to learn to walk in a completely new way, the gait of a future lotus foot. From here on, foot binding was not a one-time act, but a repeating cycle of days. Every morning the bandages were removed, the feet washed with warm water, blisters tended to, then wrapped again tighter than the day before. Every night the girl lay down but could barely sleep. Sometimes cold sweat broke out because even her heartbeat sent sharp pain through her feet. In summer, the mixture of herbs, sweat, and blood created a sour smell the family had grown used to. But to her, it was a constant reminder that her body was being reshaped. In winter, the cold made the bones ache to the core, and every step felt like walking on sharp stones. Amid these days, the mother and grandmother took on a strange dual role. They were both the ones causing the pain and the ones easing it, both strict and tender. They checked every sore, applied medicine to torn skin, then carefully rewrapped the bandages. They taught the girl how to hide her groans behind tightly pressed lips, how to maintain her posture even when her legs trembled. In their eyes, only a girl who could endure would have a future, and foot binding became the first test of life. They did not believe they were being cruel. They believed they were passing down the capital every woman needed, feet small enough to avoid ridicule. The world of foot binding tools also became clear. Only the women of the house handled the long cloth bands, washed and dried under sunlight to reduce odor. Herbal medicine, alum, Sichuan peppercorns, and ground incense wood was used to reduce swelling and prevent infection, though in reality infections often spread silently. Training shoes made for indoor use were rough, pointed, slightly upturned. Outdoor shoes were smaller and stiffer, with raised heels to create the characteristic gait. Each item was part of a technical system passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, like a meticulous craft everyone had mastered. And then came the day the family announced that the feet had begun to take shape. By then, the toes were fully folded into the sole. The arch had been forced upward like a small crescent. The heel had become the primary support for walking. But to the girl, there was nothing beautiful or shaped about it. Only unending pain and steps as unsteady as a child learning to walk for the second time in her life. Yet the adults looked at her with satisfaction, as if those months of tears and pain proved she had reached a milestone recognized by society. From that moment on, each of her steps was no longer simply movement from one place to another, but a lifelong performance through which people judged her virtue, her family, and her worth. It was the moment marking a bitter transformation, the physical pain of a child being upheld as evidence of refined beauty. And from those newly bent feet, an entire social structure around marriage, status, and morality would begin to operate, leading directly into the stories that follow, where bound feet cease to be a personal matter and become an invisible thread determining a woman's fate for the rest of her life. And from those unsteady steps, an entire world outside the small chamber began to move. Once the feat had been formed, the family regarded it as a shared accomplishment. No one named the pain she had endured. Instead, they saw her as a flower bud blooming in the right direction. On the first day she was allowed to wear her new pair of lotus shoes, her mother laid a clean mat in the middle of the yard. Her grandmother sat beside her, tending to every detail of the tiny feet, while her father stood quietly at a distance, his heart full of pride he could barely conceal. The girl wobbled a few steps, and though each step sent a numb ache up her spine, the whole family nodded approvingly, praising her for being beautiful, light, graceful. It was those praises, repeated over and over, that laid before her a path where pain was wrapped in the fabric of family pride. As she grew older, she came to understand that her feet were not merely a part of her body, but a property her parents would bring forth in marriage talks. The village matchmaker, whenever passing by, always glanced at her feet first, even asking her to walk a few slow steps to read her fortune. They examined the arch of her instep, the distance between heel and toe, the softness of the shoe's fabric, then turned to whisper to her mother. Good, promising future. She didn't know what that future specifically meant. She only felt the evaluative gaze of adults inspecting each of her steps, as though they were appraising a precious item. And so, without knowing when it began, she learned to walk so that her feet made a faint rustling sound, the tips of her shoes trembling slightly to create an impression of softness, while she kept her back straight to maintain the elegance of her gait. In wealthier families, small feet were regarded as proof that the daughter need not do heavy labor. When guests visited, the mother often could not hide her pride, saying her daughter walks like a light breeze, her feet hardly touch the ground, then discreetly inviting the guests to admire the newly embroidered shoes. Girls with bound feet were raised in bright rooms, always wearing fine clothes, practicing embroidery and music. They were taught how to sit so their garments wouldn't crease, how to tilt their heads so their hair would fall just gracefully enough, and how to walk so onlookers would feel they were watching a lotus sway gently in the wind. But behind that elegance lay the truth. They could not run, could not keep up with life outside the family gate, and every movement, no matter how small, was a lesson repeated through pain. The lives of girls with bound feet in poor families were the complete opposite. Though they too were required to keep their feet as small as possible, they still had to work in the fields, go to the market, carry water, grind rice. Such tasks twisted their feet horribly, sometimes causing deep wounds where the bandages stuck to raw flesh. Yet paradoxically, even when they could barely stand due to the pain, during harvest season or family ceremonies, they were still expected to wear lotus shoes to preserve the family's face. And on market days, many rural mothers would place their daughters before the stalls so buyers and sellers could look directly at their gait, a form of silent marketing of virtue. Each step on those days was both physical humiliation and an invisible pressure, forcing them to appear gentle even when every nerve screamed with pain. For the girl in this story, the world she was allowed to access was very small. From the chamber where her feet were bound, she could go to the yard, the veranda, and at most to the gate on special days. Bound feet made leaving the house difficult, but society considered that a good thing. The less a woman went out, the more virtuous she was deemed. Thus, the village paths, where children played, vendors argued, and men discussed the harvest, became foreign worlds to her. Her tiny feet shrank her living space, and that confinement made her more dependent on her family, more obedient. A girl who seldom went outside had fewer chances to stray, and people saw this as proof of proper upbringing. No one asked what she actually wanted. When she reached marriageable age, her bound feet became the brightest highlight of her matrimonial resume. Rumors about her beautiful lotus heels spread quickly. The groom's family cared not only about her skills, but also about her bouncing gait, the soft rustle like silk when she walked. Many arranged meetings unfolded in a strange silence. The young man sat drinking tea, the elders conversed, and the girl was asked to walk from the door to the tea table. Just a few steps. Yet those few steps decided her entire life. If her steps sounded too heavy, they said she lacked refinement. If she trembled too much, they said, too much pain isn't good either. If the tips of her shoes weren't beautifully curved, they blamed the mother. But if everything aligned, they considered it a blessing for the groom's family. A girl's life was reduced to a handful of footsteps. Wealthy families often kept their daughters hidden in carefully decorated rooms to keep their feet like new. Meanwhile, poor girls knew that if their feet lost beauty even for a few key moments, they could lose their chance at marriage. Thus, they learned to preserve beauty temporarily, wearing shoes only during arranged meetings, village festivals, or when guests came, at other times letting their feet rest or rewrapping them to hold their shape. Class divisions became so clear that one could distinguish rich from poor girls simply by their gait. Foot binding, seemingly only a matter of aesthetics, became a map of social hierarchy. But the most crucial point is not marriage or status, it is how foot binding redefined women's labor. Though they struggled to walk, these girls took on most of the household work, weaving fabric, spinning thread, sewing and embroidery, making handicrafts, even managing the family's finances. They worked quietly, unseen in the fields, yet produced steady income. This led society to mistakenly believe that women with bound feet did not labor, when in reality they worked tirelessly in a space invisible to outsiders. This was one reason foot binding endured so long. It did not turn women into burdens, it transformed them into stationary labor forces, enclosed yet efficient in ways society desired. That cruel beauty was justified by silent productivity. At the same time, classical literature and art spun a romantic mist over women's suffering. Poets praised lotus steps, 3-inch golden lotuses, footsteps like mist, while painters depicted young women holding fans by lattice windows, standing so delicately that a breeze could topple them. These paintings and verses were celebrated as the height of feminine beauty, yet no one mentioned the nights when girls curled up crying in pain, nor did anyone paint the scene of a mother struggling to change blood-soaked bandages. Poetry turned suffering into a seductive symbol, and society used those very symbols to impose expectations on women. And so, from the feet bent in a small chamber, a vast network of marriage, class, labor, and art wrapped itself around the girl's life. No one asked whether she wanted her feet bound. That question never existed. In a world where everyone believed that small feet were a ticket to happiness, she could only walk the predetermined path, even though every step made her heart ache. Yet that seemingly unshakable world would soon begin to tremble as new winds arrived, raising a question that for centuries no one dared to ask. Was this beauty truly beauty, or merely a wound covered in silk? But that seemingly stable world began to tremble when strange bits of news filtered into the village through scattered stories. It started with a few rumors from scholars and merchants returning from afar. Westerners were astonished to see Chinese women walking unsteadily. They called it a barbaric custom, a sign of a people weakening themselves. Then came the drawings and books brought by missionaries, depicting Western women walking upright, strong, and unafraid. In the big cities, ideas of reform and modernization began to rise, and bound feet, once the pride of society, were suddenly placed under scrutiny. People said that if the nation wanted to be strong, its women had to be healthy, and to be healthy, feet could not be bound. Wherever such words spread, unrest followed, and no one imagined that one day, inside the very house familiar with the tiny footsteps of the girl, a confrontation would become inevitable. The strangest thing was that the debate did not begin with outsiders. It began right at a family meal. Her father, who seldom talked about women's matters, brought home a newspaper from the district one day containing an article by a reformer on women's education, teaching women literacy, hygiene, and above all, abandoning foot binding. He read aloud several passages, his voice uncertain yet filled with hesitation. The grandmother immediately put down her chopsticks, her face darkening as she insisted that without foot binding, women would have nothing to take pride in, that she herself and the girl's mother were respected precisely because of their bound feet. Her mother looked at her own feet, then at her daughter's, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. As for the girl, she sat silently, not daring to raise her head, because for the first time in her life, she heard someone suggest that her suffering might be meaningless. Outside, peddlers, merchants, and idle townsfolk began discussing the matter. Some mocked the new movement, dismissing it as the antics of the westernized, of those who betrayed tradition. Others, especially fathers with young daughters, listened quietly, imagining their children enduring such pain. These whispers gradually became a stronger current when associations called natural foot societies began forming in towns. They printed leaflets, held public talks, and went door to door urging families not to bind their daughters' feet. Some were so zealous they proposed taking newly bound foot girls to hospitals to have their bandages removed immediately. But in rural villages, where traditions were deeply rooted, such actions were regarded as a direct insult to the social order. During those days, the girl began noticing things she had never dared think about before. Each morning, when she unwrapped the bandages to wash her feet, she saw her toes bent like pieces of wood under pressure, the darkened skin around her joints ready to burst. She remembered the nights when, listening to the wind outside, the pain in her feet shot up her back, and she wondered, was this really necessary to be considered beautiful? But as soon as the thought appeared, she extinguished it, afraid of being judged unfilial, for only bad daughters questioned family tradition. The boundary between personal desire and duty was bound as tightly as her feet, turning every stray thought into a sin. The anti-foot binding movement came not only from books and intellectuals, but also from state policies. In the final years of the Qing dynasty, princes and high ministers issued edicts demanding officials and their families set an example by abandoning foot binding. Then, in the Republican era, the new government issued a nationwide ban, even fining families who continued the practice. Inspection teams traveled district to district, ordering women to remove their bandages on the spot. News of this spread to the village, stirring unease. Some were frightened and hurried to loosen their daughters' bindings. Others were determined to resist, insisting this was a family affair, and that neither the dynasty nor the government had the right to interfere in the affairs of their daughters' chambers. Meanwhile, the inner turmoil of women who had lived their whole lives with bound feet became most apparent. The grandmother, once proud of her tiny feet, now felt insulted as society began calling them marks of cruelty. She could not accept that something which once earned her respect was now labeled backward. Her mother was different. She stood between two eras. Deep down, she wanted her daughter to suffer less, but she feared that if the bandages were removed, the girl's future would be bleak. And the girl, who endured throbbing pain every day, felt like an object pulled between two forces. On one side, a 1,000-year tradition, on the other, a new world pounding at the door. Many families fell into conflict. In some households, the father insisted on stopping foot binding, while the mother secretly wrapped their daughter's feet for fear that big feet mean no marriage. In others, the grandmother hid the girl's shoes and bandages, only for the mother to accept new ones from relatives. Some girls unwrapped their own feet, only to be beaten and forced to bind them again, because a daughter must preserve her parents' honor. Even in the darkest nights, when the pain was so unbearable, she wanted to tear everything off and run out of the room. She did not dare, knowing the outside world would not forgive her difference. But the more foot binding was forbidden, the stronger the natural foot movement grew. Newly trained female teachers appeared, bringing lessons on health, human rights, and the idea that women could walk naturally and still remain virtuous and bring honor to their families. In small classrooms, when girls with bound feet saw these teachers moving briskly and confidently, they glimpsed for the first time a different image of womanhood, neither distorted nor restricted, respected, without needing an unnatural gait. That image quietly entered their hearts like seeds beneath hard soil, waiting for the chance to sprout. Older women, on the other hand, faced a harsh truth. The standard they had devoted their lives to had been abandoned by history. Some tried to justify that their time was different, that women back then had only one path to acceptance. Others stayed silent, knowing they could change nothing. Some even wept when they saw their grandchildren walking freely, running without the burden of bound feet. Those tears carried both joy and bitterness, as if they finally realized what no one had dared to say for decades, that their lives, their imposed beauty, their suffering, might have been nothing more than the product of a society that had never given them a choice. During those turbulent years, small stories emerged that represented an entire era. A girl who fled from foot binding following the new movement was mocked by her village, but later became the county's first female teacher. A 70-year-old woman was ordered by an inspection team to remove her bandages, only to find that her heel, accustomed to its old shape, could no longer support her, leaving her dependent on a wheelchair for the rest of her life. A family continued binding their daughter's feet in secret, believing the new trend would pass, but it did not. And when the girl grew up with deformed feet, the world had already changed completely. All these upheavals converged on one point. For the first time in over 1,000 years, people dared to question an unquestioned ideal of beauty. Praise for the Lotus Gate began to crumble. Reformers, activists, and government policies collectively attacked the old standard. Suddenly, what was once considered the refined symbol of Chinese femininity became evidence of oppression. Bound feet, something that once filled families with pride, became testimony to an age people desperately wanted to leave behind. Yet the greatest question still hovered. As the old standard collapsed, what would become of the women who had lived their entire lives within that framework? And what would remain as history turned the page into the modern era? And as the old standard was swept away like a broken dam, women with bound feet no longer stood at the center of pride, but quietly fell into the empty space between two eras. They could not become the new icons of a changing world, yet they no longer belonged to the old world that had once regarded them as the ideal of beauty. When the girl of long ago entered old age, her heels stiffened and curled, her steps reduced to an effort to cling to the ground, the era had completely changed. Many years later, when she saw children running around the courtyard, she understood that the natural foot movement had not been a passing breeze, but a storm that swept away everything that once confined the women of previous generations. By the mid-20th century, foot binding had almost disappeared from all of China. The women who once suffered to obtain small feet suddenly became the few who were left behind. A solitary dot amid new roads, bicycle bells, streetcars, and the laughter of children they could no longer chase. They sat on porches or in dim rooms, their bound feet hidden beneath old cloths, no longer wanting anyone to see them. Yet ironically, at the moment they wanted to hide the past, modern society began to look back at it with curiosity, as if gazing into a dark chapter no one had ever dared to open. The girl, now an old woman, was repeatedly invited to population surveys, local cultural studies, or small interviews by students and teachers. Each time, people asked her to remove her shoes so they could record the shape of her feet as living documentation. She always hesitated, but she agreed, partly out of politeness, partly because she knew she was one of the last to carry such traces. When the thin sock was pulled down, the toes curled tightly into the sole, the foot twisted to one side, the heel shrunken as if worn away. The young people around her could not suppress a sharp intake of breath. She felt embarrassed, proud, and sad all at once, a feeling hard to name, as though her entire life had been wrapped into those feet, now exposed by a single glance. Among the onlookers was her granddaughter, whose clear eyes stared intently at her grandmother's feet. When the old woman recounted her childhood foot binding, the girl asked questions that were difficult to answer. Did it hurt? Why didn't you run away? Why did people think it was beautiful? The grandmother did not blame her, for she herself had once wanted to ask her own mother the same things, but never dared. She simply smiled and replied, "Back then, we had no choice." But that very answer left the granddaughter silent for a long time, because it explained not only the past, but also marked the difference between two generations, one trapped within unbreakable rules, and the other raised with the right to question everything. In the years that followed, as the state began preserving cultural heritage, many folk museums collected lotus shoes, paintings of women with bound feet, and the life stories of surviving elderly women. Some researchers came to the village to photograph her feet, record her trembling voice describing her first binding, the first unwrapping, the time she nearly got an infection. These materials appeared in newspapers, books, and then spread around the world through modern media. She unexpectedly became the last witness of a vanished custom. But instead of pride, she felt estranged. The years of pain, the decades of pride mixed with shame, had now become something to display, to narrate, to analyze, like a strange phenomenon of history. On quiet afternoons, she often looked down at her twisted feet and thought of her mother, the woman who had wrapped her in an embrace while tightening the bandages, crying while believing she was doing the best for her child. She did not blame her mother, for she understood her mother, too, had no choice. The idea of foot binding had flowed through generations like an invisible current, so pervasive that everyone believed it was self-evident, like the sun rising in the east. Her mother had once said, "I do this so you will be happy." But at the end of her life, looking back, she was no longer sure what that happiness meant. She did not regret, but she mourned. Mourned the youth she never used to run, the roads she never walked, the feeling of wind under her feet she would never know. Once, during a school visit, a young girl stood up and asked, "Are you sad when people say foot binding is cruel?" The old woman looked at the girl for a long time before answering, "No. Every era has its good and bad. What matters is that people learn from the past." Her answer left the room silent, and then the teacher nodded, saying that was precisely why they had come, to understand that beauty is never separate from power and pressure. A custom survives not just because it is admired, but because an entire society agrees that it must. And so, from the old woman's feet, the story extended into the modern age. People began to ask, do we have new lotus feet today? New standards that force women to suffer for beauty? Invisible pressures that compel them to mold their bodies to be accepted? High heels that send pain shooting through the ankles but are still called attractive? Painful surgeries for higher noses, smaller chins, slimmer waists? Starving diets just to fit into a dress? Looking at these, people realized foot binding had not vanished. It had merely changed shape, hidden within new, more modern, more subtle rules. The old woman, though unfamiliar with terms like toxic beauty standards, understood their essence well. She told her granddaughter, "Don't let others tell you what you must look like to be loved." And that sentence was like a sewing needle stitching two eras together. From tiny lotus shoes to today's beauty trends, all reflected the same question about freedom and personal worth. A question women of her time had no right to think about. But women today do. As sunset fell, her shadow stretched long across the ground, her tiny feet appearing even more curled under the fading light. But in her slow, steady walk there was something lighter, as if the nameless burdens that had weighed on her feet were dissolving as she told her story. And in the eyes of the younger generation listening, she saw not pity, but understanding. Perhaps that is what remains after everything has changed. The lesson of a beauty once worshipped yet revealed to be only the mark of social pressure. The lesson of an era in which women could not decide even the fate of their own feet, and the lesson that every standard, no matter how beautiful, must be examined with the question, who benefits, who pays the price? And so the journey from the pair of shoes behind the museum glass, where this story began, now closes on the real feet of the old woman walking across her courtyard. A journey across 1,000 years of history, across the pain of millions of women, bringing the listener back to a question both modern and ancient. Are we truly free in our own bodies, or are we still walking on feet bound by the invisible rules our era imposes?